All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Heyman, the president of Demand Spring. It is a pleasure to be with you today and to be part of this outstanding event hosted by the B2 SMB Institute. In this session, myself and my two guests, Gino Pelosi from Dun & Bradstreet and Christine Washburn from Berkshire Grey, will be discussing the impact that COVID-19 has had on the way that SMB buyers are evaluating and purchasing products and services right now. Our goal is to provide you with actionable insights to help you serve your buyers and drive positive business outcomes during this time. Before I dive in, I'll do some quick introductions. I have spent the past 24 years as a marketing leader with small and mid-sized businesses such as Demand Spring, Watchfire, and Corel, as well as large organizations like IBM and Cognos. I founded Demand Spring in 2012. We are a marketing consultancy that helps B2B organizations transform their marketing practices to drive pipeline and revenue growth. We work with a number of large enterprises who sell into smaller organizations, including organizations like Fidelity Investments, BNY Mellon, Iron Mountain, Staples, Akamai, and many others. My two guests today have outstanding backgrounds for this discussion. Gino Pelosi is Senior Vice President of Marketing for Dun & Bradstreet and has previously held marketing executive roles at IBM and Cisco. Welcome, Gino. Can you please tell us a little bit more about your background and your experience marketing to SMBs?
Sure. So my background, I started about the same time, probably 25 years ago, and various companies, sizes of anywhere from 5 companies all the way up to 300,000 when IBM was in their heyday. And I think, my experience in SMB has changed over the years. I think in some of the bigger companies I've been at, it's been a challenge for them. And I think, we didn't really focus as much as we could have, solely because the cost of acquisition at places like IBM, it was really hard to go after those at the high touch techniques available to us at the time. So they saw the market was huge. They went after it, but it was really kind of a focus that, we struggled with, quite honestly. I think that has changed over the years. I didn't really get the background around SMB until I recently went to work for a company locally here in Columbus. And that was a company focused around driving digital experience and agency type work to the mid-market, right? To the small and medium-sized businesses in the Midwest. And it was a different world, right? They have different needs and we recognize that, and you have to approach them differently and engage them differently. So I think that was my real first foray into that. And obviously, in my current role at D&B, we do help a lot of clients who are out there looking and very much interested in B2B into that smaller mid-sized segment. So I think that the world has changed, as we'll talk about today, and I've learned a lot along the way, especially in the last 5 years. So.
Yeah, that's great, Gino. Delighted to have you on. Your experiences at G2O and at D&B, and just your overall depth of experience as a marketing leader will be very valuable for our listeners today. Christine Washburn is the CMO of Berkshire Grey, a technology company doing amazing things to automate fulfillment in the retail and logistics industries using AI and robotics. She was previously the CMO of Rocket Software and has had senior marketing executive roles at Dassault Systems and in Servio. Christine will be able to provide a great perspective today as both a marketer as well as an SMB buyer of marketing services. It's great to have you on today, Christine. Can you share a little bit more about your background as well, please?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. I'm glad to be here. I'm probably not your typical high-tech CMO in that I actually started in politics, which is a bad thing, I think, sometimes to say today. But I actually started as a speechwriter and a press secretary to a congressman. And what I found is that products and issues are actually, in some cases, very similar to like what I'm doing today. I've worked actually for the last 20 years at companies as small as we had everyone around a table. So very early stage startups. And then I've also worked for companies that are, multi-billion dollars in size. And what I've found just in selling to SMB is even though one would think that it might be an easier or a faster sale, in a lot of cases it's not. It's just as challenging and sometimes more so because I think your customers are choosing not necessarily between you and a competitor, but between, very different services, buying a new truck versus buying your specific service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm half tempted at this point to turn the focus of the conversation to political speech writing. I think that would be a fascinating next hour, especially in today's climate. Delighted to have you on as well, Christine. Let's dive in. We're going to zoom in on the buyer journey during COVID for the most part of this conversation. But first, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time on grounding today's discussion in the macro view of the evolution of the buyer journey over the past few years. All three of us started our careers in B2B marketing a few moons ago. I like to joke that when I started, my job was to keep the food warm and the beer cold. That was the typical job of a B2B marketer back then. Now things are dramatically different. You know, I like to believe, at least, and say that this is the golden age of B2B marketing, that we are more central to the buyer journey than we've ever been. The buyers interact with our content and digital channels throughout much of their buyer journey. I'd love to get each of your observations on how the buyer journey has evolved over these past few years. Christine, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think you made a good point in that a lot of it is digital. So obviously today, a lot of people do their homework and go and find out, you know, they're almost at the intent stage by the time they're ready to speak with you because they've gone to your website. They also go to communities, they go to, you know, other people that they trust. So that's a huge, I think, change. Also, what we also see is that, you know, there's a lot less trust. And I think some of this may have come out of sort of the financial fallout back in 2008, 2009. So there's a lot more people now that you have to deal with as part of the buyer's journey. Whereas before it was a little bit easier, I think, to, you know, maybe just engage with one person. Now there's multiple people, which means multiple content.
Yeah.
As well, that's really targeted toward them. And then the third thing I think that we're starting to see is the demographics of the buyers in the buyer journey have changed. It's millennials, right? And so they're very accustomed to talking to someone in different channels, not just via email, for example. They do a lot on social. They have very, you know, immediate expectations. You're going to get back to them not in 24 hours, but right away. And that you'll be very transparent in terms of pricing and all the information that they need. So I think lots of changes in the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. When you spoke about trust a few moments ago, you know, I think we're going to dive into that in a fairly good way over the next few minutes. You know, I like to think right now that during this COVID period, brands have the ability to and the opportunity to either build or erode trust, depending on the approach they take in their communications. You know, either serving or selling. So we'll come back to that. But that's a great point about you know, the erosion of trust, perhaps. Gino, love to hear your experiences in terms of the evolution of the buyer journey from your days at IBM and prior to that, and Cisco, and then what you've witnessed, you know, recently at G2O and at D&B.
Yeah, so what Christine said actually resonated with me, which is, you know, the expectations, number one, have changed significantly. So it's called the Amazon effect, call it that kind of, you know, I know it's not rocket science, but people have higher expectations, even if you're engaging in an organization, right? So people are buyers and organizations are not buyers. And I think the biggest change I've seen in the last 5 or 10 years is this focus on understanding that even if you're selling to an organization, large or small, you're selling to a person within that organization, and understanding their needs, their preferences, and their expectations is really important. I remember, you'll laugh because like our joint friend, Brendan, I won't call him out, used to really always have this, a friend of ours at IBM was like 10 years ago, stop using the word organization or business within a pitch deck or any communication. And the reality is it's about you. We're reaching an individual. And I think that has really been able to be really amplified now that we have the technologies to actually reach the individual and know who those individuals are and the data that's available. So that data, that focus on the person and the buyer and those buying centers has really, really allowed us to do things that we are now, we're never even thinking we could do 10 years ago. So that change and that ability to understand people and engage them and know who they are and treat them is critical to the journey.
Yeah, that's a really great point. You know, one of the things for me that's changed dramatically is prior to the, you know, the very welcomed onslaught of mostly welcomed onslaught of technology that we now have at our disposal as marketers. You know, marketers could speak to people largely through mass channels in a way that was targeted from a demographic perspective, maybe even a firmographic perspective, but never before in terms of knowing the stage of the buyer journey they were in. We could never get to that degree of relevance. And for me, that's been one of the biggest changes that has driven our ability to drive much better engagement, education, and conversion throughout the buyer journey. We're able to, much like a good sales rep reads the body language and knows at all times the stage of the buyer journey that their prospect is in, we can now do the same in marketing.
Well, Mark, and even further, if you think about the footprint people are leaving behind or the fingerprint, it used to be you could get firmographic or account data or insights because you knew the account and it was large and they were sending signals off as an organization. And it was harder to get that level of understanding in the old way, right, with these smaller organizations. Now, everybody leaves their own footprint, so you can understand who they are, what they need, and when they need it in a way that, really wasn't feasible before. And that's allowed us to kind of reach into SMB and be able to be much better at engaging them and those individual buyers.
Yeah, so Gina, you talked about really being more human in our marketing, right? Engaging people at a one-to-one level, and understanding more about them as humans, right? Not marketing to organizations, but marketing to humans. And I think when we think about how the buyer journey has now changed over the past 4 months, and how we need to engage as marketers during this time, to me, the word human, and it comes back to trust, the opportunity to build trust or erode it, has been central to what we need to think about during this time. Gina, we'll start with you. I'd love to understand what changes you've observed in the SMB buyer's journey since COVID hit in March in North America anyways.
Yeah, what I'm seeing, I think, as people obviously are working from home, right? So the buying journey has changed in the sense of how we identify. So one of the biggest changes as far as the buying journey is where people are doing the research. So Christine talked about, we know when people are going online, what they're doing, what they're looking for. And by the time they're ready to engage, we're able to actually, they're much into that qualified stage. And I think knowing that they're now at home, it's much harder in the last 3 months to be able to identify, in the old technologies, who's actually online looking. And that signal, that intent signal in some of the older technologies doesn't really allow you to do that. So we're really helping clients to think through, there are ways to do this, right? You can triangulate the IP, you can triangulate cookies, and you can actually put that together with even like device addresses to start saying, oh, Mark was visiting my site today, looking at this, because with everybody working from home, it's really kind of, in theory, could have broken a lot of the ways that people were getting that signal. And now there are ways that companies are thinking through that to do a better job of knowing who's on their site, what they're looking for, and engaging them in that contextual, timely way. So the biggest change is working from home, I think, has changed some of the fundamental models, but companies are already starting to adapt, and we're helping them to do that. So that's one of the biggest things I've seen.
Christine, I know that you are new to Berkshire Grey as their CMO. You come from Rocket Software. You joined during COVID, and you've both been building out a set of marketing practices, but also infrastructure. So you've been a buyer, an SMB buyer of services and products over this time period. Can you talk about your experience in buying technology and services, and maybe how that has been different during these last 3 or 4 months for you than it's been over the past 3 or 4 years?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I started remotely. I onboarded remotely. I've actually hired people remotely, which I never thought I would do before. And I've hired agencies, as you know, remotely as well, and bought services. In terms of what's changed, I think for me, at least, what's probably become more important is just communication or over communicating, because you're not across the table from someone, and sometimes it's hard to read body language, and I think some of the signals that you typically pick up in just a meeting, they're just not there. So what I've found is putting things in writing, over communicating, doing a webinar, being able to read things, having things stored in other places has been really useful, because there's just only so much I think you can consume on an online meeting. And so again, having things in multiple formats has been really helpful in keeping things moving.
Yeah, one of the things that we've observed, you talk about keeping things moving, we've observed, at least in our business, that people have still been spending money.
Mhm.
SMBs and larger enterprises have still been spending money. There's been, at least in our business, selling marketing services, there has been a need for organizations to pivot a fair amount of what they're doing in marketing to double down on digital. But we've also found that getting the deal signed off at the end of the day has definitely taken longer during this time period. I think, buyers still want to buy. Procurement and finance are more circumspect these days. Do you have any advice for the audience in terms of how do you, when marketing and selling into SMBs, get that deal across the goal line based on some of the challenges in getting deals signed off through procurement and finance?
I think the most important thing is to get finance involved up front.
Mm,
And as a new person, one of the first things, I think my first week, I made sure that I had a meeting with our CFO and I said, look, this is where I need to spend money. I want to make sure
mm,
before I go out and start researching some of these, capabilities and agencies and tools that the budget is there. This is my time frame for this. This is why. I think
yeah,
quantifying obviously is really important as well. And for
yeah.
us, it's all about growth. So anytime I can say this tool or this service is going to bring us X number of customers faster and at this revenue rate, that's a very powerful, compelling argument for a CFO and for anyone on the finance side of things. And then coming back to them and say, okay, I told you what I was going to spend. Now I'm ready. This is
Mm,
how we do it. And also I think flexibility. As a startup, we can't always do, 3-year contracts. We are spending money, but we just need to be able to sort of do it at our own pace.
mm.
So the flexibility to give it to us in bite-sized chunks and kind of grow with us, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, great insights. So what I'm taking away there is, not only internal champions like yourselves working with finance, but if you're a vendor selling in, don't just think about the business buyers or the technical buyers, but the actual buyers in terms of procurement and finance, and make sure you're building those relationships and creating the ROI justification early on for your solution.
Absolutely.
So let's dive deeper into the doubling down on digital effect that COVID has had. I'd like to know from each of you what advice you'd give to large enterprise marketers and sellers trying to engage SMBs via digital marketing at this time. Christine, if you'd like to go first, that would be great.
Sure. And I think Gino may have said this already, but I think the biggest thing is don't be tone deaf. I can't tell you how many someone will reach out, whether it's an email or on social, and say, this is a tough time. We're all in this together. Oh, by the way, do you want to buy XX? And so, you talked about humanizing the company as well. I think that's really important too. And I mean, there may not be a tie to COVID, but as long as you can still help me solve my problems, I'm interested. It doesn't have to be COVID. And I think too often people are using that as a hook, and it's everywhere now. It's on banners on websites. It's the sub. And I think again, and this is really what remains the same. It should still be about helping me solve my problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Great insights. Gino, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think the empathy is important, right? Understanding that everybody's in a similar situation, and understanding that it's not really a chance to kind of go sell to them, but to understand where you can help, right? And what we've done, and actually it's a good example, is we're really looking to say, what is our sweet spot within, what can we add value to at this time for the people that are going through challenges? So yeah, you don't have to have that perfect message, but if you do, lean into it, because that ability to help people, say, in particular SMB, we're helping people understand where do they spend their money wisely today, right? So if you're looking at this challenge we're all having as marketers, is budgets are tightening up and you need to make sure you're getting more out of the budget. Other companies are going through the exact same thing. So if we can help them understand, hey, we understand, let us, work with you to help get more. That may mean they spend less money, right? But if we can be that trusted partner to help them be better at their spending, they're going to come back when they open that spending up, right? And they're going to us, work together to kind of figure out in this period, how do they maximize their investments? And another one in particular that's a good example is during COVID, the challenge that we have seen is things are very tumultuous, right? Things are very tough, especially for smaller companies. And you have to look at it as a marketer to say, hey, we've always looked at the fit. Is it an ideal customer, the timing or the intent? And now you can layer a third dimension, and that's really around the risk. Because if you look at the addressable market, you can start looking at fit, timing, and are they in the best situation to prioritize? And we're helping people with the COVID index to say, we know a lot about these companies. We know a lot about, their level of risk factors that they're facing, where they're located, government regulations, et cetera. And we've opened up that data to help our partners go after the right types of accounts at the right time who are in their risk profile. So that risk element, which was never really a factor when you're looking at who to go after in prioritization, has become tremendously important. So that was a sweet spot for us to say, we have the data, let us help us layer that on top for you. And we're seeing a lot of interest in people who recognize that how important that is, because they'll spend their money better on accounts that are going to be less in jeopardy, if you will. So
that's amazing. So I'd like to dive down on that a little bit more. So are you saying that you've got risk data on businesses that you've now built into your product offerings with kind of a COVID lens on it?
Yeah, we have. I mean, it's called the COVID index. So we'll do a risk health check on people's pipeline, or even the data that the list of prospects they're going after, so they can rank them based on a number of factors. It's not just risky or not risky.
Mm-hmm.
What is their defaulting factor? What is their, like I mentioned, some of the things around regulations and shutdowns, even to the point of what vendors and suppliers are they working with who may be at risk? Are they a essential business? Are they a non-essential business? All those factors will say, hey, of my priority, high fit, high intent accounts, we should be thinking about these in risk levels, because the treatment you give to them may be different. The treatment in terms of how much you spend to reach out to high risk versus lower risk. The amount of things you mentioned in the previous comment of what are even the payment terms for people who fall into that risk. Right? So you can say to the CFO now, hey, we understand that these are levels of risk. You're talking the same language, flexible terms, no payment terms, or highly flexible terms. Those could depend on the risk factor that can help accelerate that end of the get it over the goal line. So yeah, we're doing that. We're building it more and more into our products. I think it's in Hoovers. I think you have the ability to insert it into our audience targeting for digital ads. So that's a great factor to say, who do you want to go after and spend the money in the digital space, high risk or low risk?
Mm-hmm.
I would go after low risk if I had to put $1 on anything. So
you talked about empathy a few minutes ago, and one of the decisions that we've taken, and we've had a lot of discussion in our organization about in our own marketing, how much do we focus on selling versus serving and supporting during this time? And I think we've fallen more on the latter end of things. That we believe that it's a time where if we can be a voice that provides some guidance, some thought leadership in the market, that is just a human voice that shows empathy for the situation that individuals are in right now and organizations are in, that really helps to serve people, which is a big part of what our brand is about, and B, build affinity and loyalty. I'm curious to hear from both of you kind of where you've fallen on that, and how much you have maybe adjusted the mix of how you've marketed during this time, from more so obviously trying to drive the need for your products and services, versus taking a little softer stance around serving and supporting your prospects, your clients, your stakeholders overall. Christine, curious to hear what you're doing at Berkshire Grey in that area.
Sure. So as I mentioned, it's a very new department. Came out of stealth, but a couple of things. One is what we do actually, and this wasn't necessarily the message when I joined, but what we do, given that we do, big industrial fulfillments, is actually a way of protecting many retailers and companies' employees, because they don't have to have as many people standing closely together. And a lot of what they're trying to message, because again, they have employees who are working in distribution centers or fulfillment centers, is we're doing what we can to protect you and ensure that, while you're doing this essential work, we're protecting you and making sure you're in the safest environment. And so I think our marketing sort of dovetails now with that, with some of the automation that we provide, they can guarantee a much safer environment as well. Something else, and Gino talked a little bit about this, I love the idea of the COVID index. But I think I see lots of innovation coming out of this, and companies are revolutionizing their business and coming up with new products, because they have to. And one of the things that we used to do was we would send a team of engineers out to see a customer and observe sort of what they were doing today, and then make recommendations about how to change that workflow and where automation would fit. We obviously can't do that right now, but we do video. And what we've been doing is annotating those videos and now sending them back. And that's almost a product in itself. And it didn't start that way, but it's something that I think our customers have been finding really useful as kind of the secondary, solution that they can refer to, and again, see how small changes in workflows can actually help them, again, drive a lot more efficiency.
Nice. How about yourself? How much have you adapted your messaging as a result of what we're going through?
Well, when it first hit, I actually just started at D&B. So I was at G2 at the time, and we immediately wanted to think about our messaging and make sure that we had that human voice, that we weren't pandering and adding value. And I think that's a lesson that it shouldn't take a pandemic to do that. And I think that's the lesson I would have here is we have to do a better job as marketers to think about nurturing our customers and building that relationship and advocacy, because we talk about the funnel, right? And we're always measured so much on new growth and pipeline, but things like, retention and in growth in accounts, right? Those are important, but they never get the front and center. And it requires this investment in reaching out and doing things that we want to do and want to do better at. Everybody does. How do you really build a program of advocacy? And that goes back to what Christine said, which is you don't always do everything in a monetary, you don't monetize everything. There's value added services you hope to bring to the table as a partner that want them to continue to consume your services, your products, your data, whatever it is. If you're a good partner, that customer experience we all know, is winning the day. So it comes down to customer experience, nurturing, and recognizing the old adage of, hey, I could go out and get you a new customer, but what about the ones that we have, and growing and sustaining that? That happens to be not important now more than ever, but we shouldn't lose sight of it when things get better. We're doing what we need to do, and I think we're continuing to evolve that as everybody is to try to get better. It's just the balancing act needed to do that.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's easier anyways to be a great partner in good times. It's how you act in times like this that really matters, and that people remember, right? This is a great opportunity to build trust, build affinity, build loyalty based on your approach today. And it sounds like both of you are in different ways, and in ways that are product oriented, Christine, in Berkshire Gray's case, and I'm sure in the way you're marketing as well, and obviously in what you just talked about, Gino, are doing so. So things have changed for us as marketers to a certain degree. They've definitely changed for our sales partners, our sales colleagues. If we think about the disruption to their typical day of, doing sales calls face-to-face, sales processes, obviously when March hit, I think most sales reps found that nobody was answering the phone. They weren't physically there to answer the phone. So how do you get a hold of buyers from home office when, their home office isn't necessarily in a database that they're using? It's dramatically changed selling patterns and processes. And we as marketers are, largely responsible for helping to enable sellers. Curious to understand the advice that you'd have for our listeners in enabling their sales teams with the tools they need to be successful during this time frame. Christine, we'll start with you.
Sure. And I'm just going to speak in more general terms versus just talking about really specific tools. But I think the first thing is using video. And I think you've seen all sorts of companies suddenly doubling and tripling down on video in terms of helping to get sales folks trained, introducing new products, and just even saying, hey, what's going on, and using an upbeat video to communicate, one that they can, again, consume sort of on their own time, not necessarily a scheduled Zoom. So that's the first piece. I think the second piece, and this is true regardless of whether we have a pandemic or not, is just what I found that from an enablement standpoint, when you listen to your sales folks, lots of times they're the ones who are engaging with customers the most. And so they're really the best at defining what that content should be. They're the first to say, here's an issue that we're seeing with customers. And I think marketing can excel by responding and turning that concern into a piece of content that addresses that concern and that they can use, again, at various stages in the pipeline. So I think listening and using that actively to execute can, deliver some very strong content in these times as well.
That's a great point. Sales has had to pivot dramatically, but so have customers, obviously, and it's sales that can really calibrate the changes that they're going through and bring that back into marketing so that we can adapt our messaging. So, really at a time where sales and marketing alignment may be a little bit tougher than when we're in the office together, it's, as you're saying, maybe more critical than ever for us to really make sure we're reaching across the aisle between marketing and sales. Gino, how about yourself? What have you seen, and what advice do you have for how marketers can really work with sales to enable their productivity during this time?
Yeah, outside of the video, which I think actually might have an upside because video is now the new normal, which I know is a terrible catchphrase, but I think what it allows the sellers to do is to turn those in-person meetings that you wouldn't always be able to bring those experts to the table or participate in to the table in an open way, in a way that people are accepting of. So there is a positive on, there's no more in-person meetings and that's a downer, but you can allow yourselves to say, everybody's in the same boat. Let's make sure we have the right experts to join our sellers, or even to Christine's point, to listen in, right? I've been pulled into sales calls that I may not have had a chance to physically be at, more than I have in the past with this whole environment. So listening, getting the right people together, you can use that as an advantage. The other thing I would say to make it more successful, I think is we're looking at enablement, right? And you have to do enablement always, but I think in a way that is easy to consume, bite-sized. Sellers are no different than an audience, right? So we have this whole enablement group out in my team that is really making sure that they know what's coming, they are enabled to do it and sell it and communicate it. And we allow that to be always on. So we kind of almost have like a digital campaign going out to our key influencers and sellers to make sure that they're enabled. And I think doing that more and more now, remote training, bite-sized type enablement tools, video, all those things become very helpful. And I hope a lot of them stay, right? Just because we're not in the office together doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing these things.
Mm-hmm.
Ways are easier to consume and on your own time. So we're doing more and more of that, I would say.
So a lot of what you both just spoke about was technology. And, we know as marketers that we've seen a sea change in the marketing technology landscape in the past few years. I think it was about 5 years ago, there were 300 MarTech apps and platforms, and, Scott Brinker's iChart that it is right now was less crowded. Now we've got about 8,000 apps and platforms. Christine, I know you have purchased a marketing automation platform since the start of COVID, and you continue to evaluate apps to fill gaps in your portfolio. What advice do you have for technology vendors selling into SMBs at this time?
Sure, and it's just a couple points that I mentioned before. The first is be flexible. Because again, we are spending money. We're trying to do that actually pretty quickly, but we can't always do very lengthy contracts. I would say respond quickly. If you're going to take 2 weeks to get me a proposal to do something, I need to move much faster. So having that quick response, and then also I may need some hand holding. In a lot of cases, it's just me at this point. I have one other person right now on the marketing team, although we have offers out to a couple people. So I need maybe a little more hand holding than someone who's been doing this, very specifically for demand gen, for example, because I haven't necessarily been involved in some of those tools previously because I had a team. So I think those are really the key. And as I said before, grow with us. If we can buy with flexible terms, or sort of as we consume things, that's going to be a lot more attractive, and it will move much faster through finance and procurement as well.
I think that's a great point for our large enterprise audience tuning in. That I know in my experience working for large organizations like an IBM, flexibility in terms, it can sometimes be challenging in large organizations, right? But I think the ones that are going to thrive more so at this time are the ones, as you said, who will adapt, who will keep the bigger picture in mind and enable flexibility in how they work with clients. Do you know anything you'd like to add to how MarTech vendors or technology vendors overall can thrive during this time, or at least keep their head above water during this time?
Yeah, I think MarTech is interesting. It's not the silver bullet, right? It has enabled us to do things we could never do before. So as you're in the market and you recognize you're selling these capabilities, and that's really what they are, recognize the level of maturity of these organizations you're selling into. And that can vary widely. So it's not even the terms need to be flexible. Knowing what somebody that has 2 or 3 people on a marketing team can do versus somebody, to your point, Christine, that had a larger team, they have different appetites, they have different abilities to do things. So be flexible in the way you package your products and services, and also think about the way that you actually what you're helping them to solve. I mean, this is the age old. So if you have a technology, and MarTech is kind of all bleeding over each other, right? And there's a, a need and a desire to start making these things work very well together. But that doesn't mean because it can work together that somebody wants to buy it, or that they're capable, or that they have the skills to do everything. Most important to them, and then learn about how you can help to kind of make sure that you put the right sized tools and capabilities in front of them so that they're successful. They will mature and they will grow. So don't try to sell the whole thing or sell these features that they're never going to be able to really take advantage of. Let them crawl, walk, or run, and be smart enough to know where they are in that cycle, and cater to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think now more than ever, right? We've got to be really pragmatic in, what we sell to SMBs, right? And to any organization really, right? People are not going to buy shiny baubles right now. They're going to buy things that provide value, that get the job done, that have the functionality that match our needs today. And, no frivolous spending, I think, is happening right now, right?
Well, it's actually interesting. I just read a report, you've probably seen it too, on the impact of COVID on marketing spend. And the dollars are staggering in terms of the decline that's going to happen. But marketing tech is not declining. It's not growing what they had thought it was going to be. It was supposed to be in the double digits for sure, but it's holding. And where the spending is really being pulled back is a lot of that, obviously, in-person ads, even some ad in general, right? Which is a question that we should be asking ourselves. Is that the right place to reduce your spending when everybody's like flocking to the digital experience? So, but the point is digital MarTech is holding. And the reason for that is because it is an essential core capability for these marketing teams. And then what they execute, like the amount of tactics, the amount of programs that they're running, that may get curtailed. But don't be afraid to help people, especially during the time when they are spending less on the execution, to go build that foundation for success, because that money is still there. And the ones that are, going to come out of this the best are the ones who are investing now for the future.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, there's been all kinds of studies. I know HBR did a study back in 2008 where they looked at previous recessions and the organizations that fared the best both during the recessions and then coming out of them. And one of the absolute hallmarks of organizations that outperformed was they kept, from a marketing perspective, they kept spending money. They outpaced their competitors in terms of having a presence, having engagement, spending money to drive empathy and keep their brand front and center. And that had a really sustained effect both during the economic contraction and then for multiple years afterwards. So I think that's a point well said. So we've been dealing with what's happening now for most of this conversation. We've talked about how organizations can be effective in mobilizing for the current situation. One of the biggest challenges that we all face right now is what's coming next, right? And not just professionally, personally, right? We're 55 days away from school opening in many, many places, right? Are our kids going to school? Are they going to school part-time? What is that going to look like? Professionally, right? Trying to plan for a future that is so variable at this point is one of the biggest challenges that organizations face. Gino, I'd love to hear from you how you think organizations can build the flexibility and agility into their planning and execution processes to keep pace with the situation, to adapt in a nimble fashion, especially large organizations that, the larger you get as an organization, the less easy it is to be nimble. But what are some considerations? You've worked at Cisco, you've worked at IBM, you've seen larger organization processes. Love to hear your thoughts on how organizations can enable the flexibility to keep pace with what may come.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I've always believed that you need to be agile as a marketing team. And if you thought you could build out a year plan ever, you were probably kidding yourself. And you realize very quickly by June that the world has changed, pandemic or not. So my belief is that organizations need to be having some evergreen type of goals and objectives for the year. Marketing obviously is a big part of that and how you align and support that. But as you build out your goals and plan, I like to do it on a quarter by quarter basis because of the kind of the lag between the things that we're doing in third quarter, knowing that that's going to result in the outcomes that we're hoping for in fourth quarter and even in 2021. So I always encourage my team to look 2 quarters out and get a little bit more granular in that in quarter, but always be measuring, always be monitoring performance and be willing to and flexible enough, design it so you can make changes, right? And where you make changes are not in big giant pivots, but have evergreen campaigns, have these always on or nurture campaigns. What we decide to do and the topics that are most relevant, those are absolutely game to pivot. But the core of what we help people to achieve, what our value proposition is, what is our story and point of view in our ability to help you in that, that's going to need to stay, right? To a certain extent, that needs to have some legs. The areas of focus, the areas of interest, the areas of topics, that is where you can then pivot. And then obviously you need to be agile enough as an organization to follow through on the content needed, the planning needed, the execution needed. And I like to say it's an 80-20 rule to my team is in quarter, if you do a good job planning and you have good strategic alignment to what you're trying to achieve and where the business is, 80% of what you put down for your quarterly plan is probably in play and going to be executed. It's that 20% that is going to come in because of volatility in the business. What you don't want is a 20-80 rule where you only get to do 20% of what you wanted and 80% is putting you on your heels. So you need to be agile, you need to be flexible and build in processes that allow you to change the things you need to change.
Great insights. Christine, anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, again, great insights from Gino. But I think on that 20% that's variable, what I would say is you have to take a dual path there and plan for both.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have the discipline and rigor to have it go or no go. And, you know, for example, unlike some industries, shows are really important. There's a couple really big shows where you can actually show what you're doing and you can sort of experience it. Well, all of them have been canceled. So there is a possibility they may be going on next year. And if that's the case, obviously that would be a great possibility for us, but we also have to plan, you know, should we do a virtual showcase instead and be able to pivot very quickly and do that sort of thing. And again, as Gino says, the core activities should stay the same. We shouldn't be pivoting or changing those. Those should be continuing in the background.
Yeah. To me, there's also, you know, there's that need to react and to be agile, keep your core intact, like Gino's saying. But I also think there's something to be said for an element of being bold in some cases. We have, as an example, we have a client who very early on when COVID hit, they had I think their user conference was scheduled for November, and this was back in March. And the CMO at this company decided right then, when people were kind of had their sights set on, is this going to be like a 2-month thing? She canceled their event and switched it to a very purpose-built digital event at that time, and got out ahead of planning for it to really reconceptualize what it looks like digitally, right? So it's kind of, you know, with some things, I think being bold and really making some difficult decisions ahead of time as the situation evolves is also part of the mix. So we've shared some really good insights. Really hope that you know, our listeners today have benefited from your great advice. I appreciate the time that both of you have put into joining us here today. Love to understand, are there any final words of advice you give to organizations in thinking through how to adapt how they're serving buyers in the buyer journey during this time period? Christine, we'll start with you.
Sure. What I would say is deals are being done. Money is being spent, and you know, people still have goals. You still have to hit quotas. I think, you know, what we've talked about, again, using empathy and looking for ways to reinvent or revolutionize your business are probably the key things I would focus on. You know, again, out of chaos, there's always innovation, and I think we're doing that today. So it's a exciting and kind of crazy time.
Yeah, your point about innovation is so on the mark, right? When we look at great advances in innovation, you look at the technology industry, and especially, where close to home for us, a lot of the great marketing technology companies have come from our past recessions. Salesforce really grew up in 2001, as did Eloqua, and first marketing automation platform. 2008, HubSpot emerged, Hootsuite emerged, Marketo emerged. So you have a real time when there's upheaval like this, when there's displacement. It's a time where innovation and entrepreneurialism flourishes. So, how can you take advantage of that as an organization as well? Tap into that. Gino, your final thoughts, final words of advice for our audience?
But the question that I would have asked you is really, when you say where do you get started with advice? It really depends on the individual. So my first question is, take a look inward during this time and say, where are you strong? Where do you want to get better at? And then start looking at those opportunities to say, what are we doing that we don't need to be doing anymore? Because I think the biggest learning that I had during this period is to say, it gives you that chance to pause and say, what's working, what's not. And sometimes people keep doing the same thing, and you've always said, well, maybe. When the money's not there, you really get to figure out pretty quickly where you're going to place your bet. So don't be afraid to be bold, do the things differently, but then look to the future, right? And when I say the advice I'd have for SMBs, that were people going after SMBs, is to say, it's all about ABM at scale, and it's all about targeting. You need to always use your money wisely, but now more than ever, and certainly if you're going after SMBs, to say, start with the data so you know who you want to go after, what success looks like, because without the data, without the account information, then you're not really going to be able to do what you need to do, which is really be focused and targeted at going at account-based activities. So start with the data, take a look at what's working and what's not working, and really just take the time to invest in yourself and your team to build out those muscles and that flexibility to do what you always wanted to do. Do it right now, invest right now, because you will come out of this with a skill set and the ability to kind of go as the market starts coming back and catch that wave.
It's amazing. As much as things have changed in the last 5 to 7 years and how much they've changed in the last 4 months, it still always comes back to the data in marketing, right? You always start with the data, which is a tried and true approach for decades now. So great insight, great final insight, Gino. I appreciate both of you so much for joining us today and sharing your great insights. Christine, if the audience wanted to reach out and contact you, what would be the best way to do so?
LinkedIn.
Excellent. All right. Christine Washburn, Berkshire Graham, LinkedIn. Gino, how would listeners contact you?
LinkedIn, unless you have a completely tone deaf sales message for me, and then don't. But LinkedIn is the best way to reach out and connect. To do that.
Now, are you on a buyer's journey for anything right now, Gino?
I can't disclose that.
Okay. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at mark@demandspring.com. Please no sales messages, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a wonderful 45 minutes or so that we've spent here today. We hope you've enjoyed the session. We encourage you to continue watching the remainder of this excellent 3-day event. Thank you so much to the B2 SMB Institute for having us, and we wish you a good day. Thanks, everyone.